Good day. Today is Thursday, 8th January 2026. And before I proceed with this program, let me remind you again that to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. If once you've watched this video or whichever part of the video you want to watch, you decide that you've liked what you've heard and wish to indicate that fact. Now, with all of this, let me now go straight into the program, the video, because it seems to me that we are on the cusp of very important and very interesting developments in terms of the relations between the United States and Russia and the situation in Ukraine, but also in relation to the wider policies that the United States is going to be following over the next few years, certainly while President Trump remains president of the United States, and perhaps beyond that. In fact, I'm confident that they will reflect the changes that will continue beyond that. Now, let me first begin with the incident that I started my program with yesterday, which is the Bella 2, the tanker that escaped, was steaming northwards from the Caribbean, sailing towards Russia, which painted a Russian flag on its hull, which claimed to have registered Russian ownership, and which appeared to be making a dash for a Russian port. Most reports agree that the port in question was Murmansk. And as I discussed extensively at the start of my program yesterday, there were many reports that the Russian Navy was rushing ships to try to escort and protect the tanker, whose original name was the Bella 2, but which then changed its name to Marinara. Anyway, there were reports which were sourced from the US government, the Pentagon in other words, and which were reported by the Wall Street Journal, that the Russians were sending a submarine to try to escort this ship. Anyway, very soon after I made my video yesterday, and as I rather anticipated over the course of the video, the United States, with some assistance from Britain, which, by the way, the British have typically talked up, seized the Marinara. I will call it the Marinara from this point going forward. This was done off the coast of Scotland. It was not, contrary to some British reports, as far as I can see, in British territorial waters, but the operation was clearly conducted with British assistance and from British territory. And the result is a great deal of information began to trickle out about the operation and about the ship itself, and we've had interesting statements from the United States. Now, the first thing I would say is that over the course of yesterday and this morning, there's been a cluster of articles which I have seen, which argue against any Russian attempt to actually send naval escorts of any kind to protect the ship. Now, and some of these articles have also downplayed the Russian connection with this ship. And very interestingly, as we shall see, the United States authorities are themselves doing this. They are suggesting that the ship was never Russian, that it was never Russian owned, that the flag that it had raised, the Russian flag, was essentially a false flag. They are doing everything they possibly can, as far as I could see, to distance Russia from this ship and to imply that its activities had basically nothing to do with the Russians, but were related exclusively to illicit trade in oil with Venezuela, the implication being that this has all been done in some way on behalf of Iran. Now, before I proceed, I should say that the information I have received, and some of it I've received from reading the British media, where articles briefly appeared, ephemerally appeared, which appear to confirm this. The information I have is that the Russians did indeed try and send ships, maybe a submarine, but perhaps more plausibly surface ships, to provide escorts and to protect the Marinara. And there was even a report which said that when the Marinara was seized, the Russian ships were just past the horizon. And in fact, the reports suggested, and I believe this to be true, that what basically happened was that the ship was seized before the Russian warships, which may or may not have included a submarine, arrived on the scene. And this makes perfect sense. The Marinara, the Bella 1, was sailing from the Caribbean. It made a quick dash northwards. It had obviously not coordinated its movements in any way with the Russian authorities. It was trying to escape towards Murmansk with the United States Coast Guard in hot pursuit. And it is logical that the Russians, if they were trying to protect the Marinara, would have been caught on the hoof and would have had to try and deploy naval assets as quickly as they could from wherever they could to do so. And given that the major bases of the Russian Navy are in the Arctic, in Murmansk and the Kola Peninsula, it would not be surprising if these warships, had left Russian ports, tried to rendezvous with the Marinara as it was passing the coast of Scotland on its way towards Murmansk. So logistically, geographically, this makes sense. But let's put aside these reports about Russian naval movements for a moment, and let's look instead at a statement that the Russian Foreign Ministry has published. Because whereas the Americans are trying to deny that the Marinara had a Russian connection, the Russians categorically say that it did. This is what the Russian Foreign Ministry said. We call on Washington to resume compliance with the fundamental norms and principles of international maritime navigation and immediately cease its illegal actions against the Marinara and other vessels engaged in law-abiding activities on the high seas. We reiterate our demand that the United States ensure humane and dignified treatment of the Russian citizens comprising the tanker's crew, strictly observe their rights and interests, and make no obstacles to their prompt return to their homeland. Then we're told that the Foreign Ministry went on to express serious concern over the US military's use of force against the tanker. The Marinara, which on December 24th received temporary permission to sail under the Russian flag in accordance with international law and Russian legislation, was peacefully transiting international waters in the North Atlantic, heading for one of Russia's ports. The US government has repeatedly received reliable information, including from the Russian Foreign Ministry, about the ship's Russian origin and its civilian status. They could not have any doubts about this, just as there were and are no grounds for arguing that the tanker was sailing without a flag or under a false flag. Russia did not give the consent to these actions. On the contrary, it lodged an official protest with the US government regarding the pursuit of the Marinara by a US Coast Guard vessel over the past several weeks, insisting on the immediate cessation of these activities and the withdrawal of the unlawful demands made on the Russian ship's captain. And the statement that continues that US military personnel boarding a civilian vessel on the high seas and effectively seizing it as well as capturing its crew can only be viewed as a gross violation of the basic principles and norms of international maritime law and freedom of navigation. And the fact that the United States is citing its own sanctions to justify this is unacceptable. Unilateral restrictive measures by the United States as well as other Western countries are illegitimate and cannot justify attempts to establish jurisdiction and even more so to seize ships on the high seas. The statements by some US officials that the seizure of the Marinara is part of a broader strategy to establish Washington's unlimited control over Venezuela's natural resources are extremely cynical. We strongly reject such neo-colonialist tendencies. So the Russians are saying straight away this is totally unacceptable behavior. American denials that this was a Russian-owned ship are false. American claims that the ship had no right to raise the Russian flag are false. The United States seized a ship that was Russian-owned and under Russian protection, and this is unacceptable, and the United States cannot use as its justification its own sanctions for doing this. So this is a strong statement from the Russian Foreign Ministry, and it takes me back to my points in my program yesterday. I think the Russians understood perfectly well that they would not be able to prevent the United States from seizing the Marinara. The ball had been set rolling. The Coast Guard was in pursuit of this ship. The British obviously were involved. It was off the coast of Britain. I think, in fact, I'm sure that the Russians did indeed send warships to try to take the Marinara under protection, but there was no organized and structured convoy to protect this ship. This was a hasty improvisation, which was impossible. The Russians, in effect, sent out a signal to the United States that this is completely unacceptable behavior, that interference with Russian merchant ships, ships flying the Russian flag, ships which are Russian-owned, are unacceptable, and that in future, when the Russians are better prepared to deal with this kind of thing, they will ensure that these ships like the Marinara, have proper naval protection. And the United States appears to have absorbed the message. And that explains, in my opinion, why the United States is now going out of its way to deny a connection between Russia and the Marinara, despite the Russian insistence that that connection existed. They're saying, well, no, actually, we seized the ship, but it wasn't Russian. It wasn't supposed to fly the Russian flag at all. We acted because it was involved in blockade running against Venezuela. This is a move related purely to Venezuela and to Venezuela's trade in oil. It is not in any way directed at Russia. It is not intended to impede or affect Russia's overseas trade. It is not an attack on a Russian ship, and it is not an attack on the Russian flag. That is what the United States is saying, and for that reason also, the United States and Britain are no longer talking about the movement of Russian naval escorts heading towards the Marinara in order to put the ship under protection. So the Russians made their point, and I think, as I said in my program yesterday, that was all at this point that they could do. But in future, they will react much more strongly if Russian ships are indeed intercepted and the United States or other NATO countries seek to board them. And I should say that the British Defence Secretary, John Healey, deviating from the line the US authorities are taking, seemed basically to threaten other Russian merchant shipping in ways that was not done by the United States. Just saying. And the Russians, as I said, have now drawn a line, and they've said that from this point on, they will organise proper convoys. They will make sure that all ships, all maritime ships that do business with Russia and which are Russian owned, will fly under the Russian flag. More and more of them are doing so and are registering in ways that I suspect will place the question of their ownership beyond any possible doubt. And anyway, as I said, I think this is all that the Russians were able to do in this particular instance. Now, there is some unanswered question still about the Marinara. I incline to the view that this was indeed owned by someone who at least had some connections with Russia. But it turns out that the crew, most of the crew, were not Russian at all. They were Ukrainian. There were 28 people who made up the crew. 20 of them were Ukrainians, 6 were Georgians, and only 2 were Russians. Though perhaps a possible implication in this statement by the Russian Foreign Ministry is that the captain, one of the 2 Russians, was the captain. But I'm not going to say that definitely because I don't definitely know. And of course that does beg questions. It does beg questions about who did actually own the ship and what it was doing. Well, as I said, blockade running is something that is improvised and done in all sorts of ways. And if you know anything about shipping, you know that crews can be put together in all sorts of complex and strange ways. It could have been that the owner, the actual owner, is a Ukrainian with some connections to Russia. And that would not surprise me at all. It would be completely consistent. But in a sense, the issue here is not the Marinara itself, what it was doing. It was the Russians giving a message to the Americans that Russian-owned ships and ships that are legally flying the Russian flag are not fair game on the high seas. The Russians will protect them. They will use their navy if they must, and that the United States should leave these ships alone. And as I said, the messages from the United States strongly suggest to me that this message has been accepted. Now, I devoted a little time to this. I should say partly it's because, having a Greek background myself, I do take a great interest in ships and things, and I have been on the peripheral side of the shipping industry as well. I never worked for a shipping firm, but I have known many people who did, and I've known various Greek ship owners in my time. So as I said, this does all interest me greatly, but I do think that this does have a wider geopolitical significance. It does suggest that the Russians are indeed becoming more assertive, or at least they are becoming assertive, and they are starting to push back. And we could see that the actions that they are taking by getting ships which trade with Russia to raise Russian flags and to register properly on the Russian merchant shipping register are all signs that the Russians are now taking stronger steps to protect their maritime trade. So that's interesting in itself, but coming back to my point about the Russians becoming more assertive, there's been some evidence, in fact there's been quite a lot of evidence, that the Russians are also taking more action against American economic assets in Ukraine itself. And the most interesting discussion of this is in Larry Johnson's indispensable blog, Sonar 26. And the article is titled, Did Russia Just Send a Message to Donald Trump? And it starts on January 6th, Christmas Eve, by the Russian Orthodox calendar. Russia launched 3 major missile strikes against US-owned facilities in Ukraine. In the Dnipropetrovsk region, Russian ballistic missiles decimated the Olena oil extraction plant, which is owned by the American Bung company from St. Louis. Its official name is the Dnipropetrovsk Oil Extraction Plant, located in Dnipro, central Ukraine. It is a major sunflower seed processing facility specializing in crushing, refining, and bottling sunflower oil. And then we're told that in western Ukraine, in Transcarpathia, Russian drones and ballistic missiles caused critical damage to the Flex plant, which also belongs to American investors. Flex Limited, a Singaporean American company headquartered in Austin, Texas, operates a major manufacturing site in Mukachevo, Zakarpattia district, western Ukraine, which opened in 2012. The facility specializes in civilian electronic production, e.g. household appliances like coffee machines, printer components, and injection molded plastics. It employs thousands and was significantly damaged in a previous Russian missile strike on August 21st, 2025, injuring workers and sparking international commentary as an attack on US-owned infrastructure. The Russians, by the way, claim that the Flex factory provides electronic components for the Ukrainian military, and I strongly suspect that it is true. But note that we are talking here about an important American-owned factory in Ukraine. And that isn't the end of it, because Larry Johnson then also goes to say that Russia also launched a massive missile attack on an American-owned maritime terminal, Olympex, which is considered the largest in the Odessa region. And this has previously been attacked in July. The terminal is one of the largest grain export facilities in the country, with an annual throughput capacity of up to 5 million tons. And then Larry Johnson says that this was also used, or at least there's suspicions that this was also used, not just for the grain trade, but also for other things, and that this particular facility, the marine terminal, was protected by Patriot air defense systems, which suggests that it is indeed seen by the United States and Ukraine as a strategic facility, that the Russian missiles nonetheless were able to strike it unimpeded, and that there were enormous explosions, so powerful that a supermassive mushroom cloud arose over Odessa, which indicates that this marine terminal terminal contained numerous warehouses filled with NATO weapons. Now, Larry Johnson links these Russian attacks to the drone attack on Novgorod, which the Russians say was an attack on Putin's residence in Valdai, and which looks, according to the Russians, to have been an assassination attempt on Putin himself. I've discussed this extensively in previous programs, and we've also discussed this attack extensively on the Duran as well. Well, that may be so, though I have to say that attacks of this kind usually take time to prepare, and whilst I suspect the Russians could do all the planning for these attacks over a fairly short schedule, my sense is that this was all pre-prepared in advance and that it's not directly connected to the drone attack on Valdai. What we see is the Russians again taking action against American economic interests and assets in Ukraine. And of course, it should not escape notice that with the fall of Stepnogorsk in Zaporozhye region, the Russians have also taken control of Ukraine's biggest deposit of manganese, which is located in the area of Stepnogorsk. And that, of course, was one of the big deposits, mineral deposits, that would have been included within the framework of the Ukrainian-American mineral rights extraction deal, which the Americans and the Ukrainians negotiated and agreed with each other, several months ago now. So, the Russians are now taking steps to protect their merchant shipping, increasingly open and assertive steps to protect their merchant shipping, or so it certainly seems to me, sending messages about it to the United States, and they're sending another message to the United States, which is that economic exploitation of Ukraine by the United States without Russia is absolutely not acceptable to the Russians either. That the Russians will act against American economic assets in Ukraine, and they're not prepared to show restraint simply because these assets are American owned, as, by the way, they used to do in the first years of the special military operation. So the Russians are already starting to take a tougher line against the Americans. Now, the Russians have given further indications that after the Christmas holiday, they are becoming more assertive, because the Russian Foreign Ministry has now published a very strong statement connected to the recent meeting in Paris, the meeting on the 6th of January, in which France, Germany, and Britain spoke about deploying European forces to Ukraine following a peace agreement, which, by the way, they still frame as a ceasefire, and where there was again significant talk about security guarantees. The Russians have made absolutely clear that they strongly oppose all of this, and the language of the Russian Foreign Ministry statement is unambiguous. On January 6th in Paris, participants of the so-called Coalition of the Willing, led by the UK and France, signed a declaration entitled Robust Security Guarantees for a Solid and Lasting Peace in Ukraine. The document turned out to be far from a peace settlement. The declaration is not aimed at achieving a lasting peace and security, but rather at continuing the militarization, escalation, and further conflict aggravation Its core element is the deployment of a multinational force on Ukrainian territory that the coalition will have to form to contribute to the rebuilding of the Ukrainian armed forces and support deterrence following the cessation of hostilities. The document also includes clauses on further consolidation of Ukraine's and NATO's military industrial sectors. As clarified by Starmer and Macron, who signed the corresponding trilateral statement, along with Zelensky, London and Paris plan to establish their own military bases in Ukraine post-ceasefire and build weapon and military equipment storage facilities. Now, in fact, the British and the French are talking about what they call hubs in Ukraine. That they're going to be military hubs in Ukraine. This is clearly an attempt to fool the Russians, to establish military bases in Ukraine. The Russians have had no difficulty in seeing through that extremely thin disguise, and we see that they say straightforwardly that the British and French plan is to establish military bases in Ukraine. And the Foreign Ministry continues that it warns that the deployment of military units and the setting up of military facilities, storages and other Western infrastructure on Ukrainian territory will be qualified as foreign intervention that directly threatens the security of Russia and other European countries. All such units and facilities will be considered legitimate military targets for the Russian armed forces. Warnings to this effect have been repeatedly made at the highest level and remain relevant. We also reaffirm that a peaceful resolution of the conflict is solely possible through the elimination of its root causes, the re-establishment of Ukraine's neutral non-aligned status, its demilitarization and denazification, and Kiev's observance of the language, culture and religious rights and freedoms, including those of ethnic Russians, Russian-speaking people and members of ethnic minorities, and through recognition of the current territorial realities that emerged as a result of the people's exercise of their right to self-determination. All these goals will undoubtedly be achieved either by political and diplomatic means or in the course of the special military operation in which the Russian armed forces are maintaining full initiative on the battlefield. The new militaristic declarations of the so-called Coalition of the Willing and the Kiev regime are forming a true axis of war. Its participants' plans are becoming increasingly more dangerous and destructive for the future of the European continent and its residents, who are also forced by Western politicians to pay for such ambitions out of their own pockets. So that is an extremely clear statement. This entire proposal that was put out on the 6th of January is totally unacceptable in every form and particular to the Russians. The Russians utterly reject any idea of European forces in Ukraine. They will consider that, in effect, an act of war. Notice that the article, the statement, actually refers to the creation of a war axis of the various European powers that press forward with this plan. And the Russians also speak about how Ukraine not only must demilitarize and denazify, but that it must again return to its neutral, non-aligned status and its demilitarization. So, Article 5 guarantees, security guarantees, tantamount to NATO membership, obviously unacceptable. They flatly contradict the concept of Ukraine having a neutral and non-aligned status. And Ukraine's demilitarization remains an absolute central Russian objective, about which the statement, the foreign ministry statement, says that the Russians are not going to compromise. And that, of course, again, precludes not just the various plans that Macron, Starmer, Merz, Rutte, Ursula, and some people in the United States have cobbled together about taking steps to help Ukraine to build up its forces in order to defend itself. But of course, it also contradicts the entire notion of Ukraine having armed forces of 600,000 men or 800,000 men or whatever fantastic figure Zelensky, his officials, and Zelensky's European friends pluck out of the air. So the Russians have, in effect, trashed the entire European initiative. They've trashed Zelensky's 20-point plan, which I've discussed extensively, which basically provides for all of these things that the Russians are now criticizing: European peacekeepers, security guarantees, Article 5 type security guarantees, all of those things. The Russians have trashed it. And Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, who is most closely attuned to Russian thinking, he's come out and also said that this entire 20-point plan is completely unrealistic because the Russians won't accept it. And this is obviously correct. So, a very forthright statement by the Russians. The Russians, as I said, attacking American economic assets in Ukraine, and the Russians making more assertive noises about the situation on the high seas. So that then brings me back to what it is exactly that the Americans think they're doing and whether they're thinking properly about this at all. At this meeting in Paris on the 6th of January, it's now clear that the British, the French, and the Germans, and by the way, Zelensky too, assumed that Kushner and Witkoff would sign off on behalf of the United States on the various statements of intent that had been drawn up, both in connection with the security guarantees that the United States they were expecting was going to give to Ukraine, and to US support for this European force that is supposed to be heading towards Ukraine. And the sense of dismay, at least in London, that Kushner and Witkoff didn't do that simply cannot be overstated. The media in London were clearly primed in the first hours, as I well remember, of this meeting in Paris to come out with statements about how the United States and the Europeans had closed ranks and that the United States was backing a European force to be sent to Ukraine and was also committing itself in a signed written document, published written document, to providing Article 5 type security guarantees to Ukraine. And clearly there were expectations that documents like that would come out of that meeting in Paris. And I don't think it is overstating things to say that there is shock and dismay and deep anger, at least in London, that this did not happen. And, well, there's a lot of questions as to why it didn't happen. Some people in London are noticing that Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State, who was expected to attend this meeting, didn't show, that Witkoff and Kushner came instead. There is a sense that the excuses that Rubio is giving for not coming are inadequate. Obviously, there's an awful lot going on with respect to the Venezuelan crisis. But the Europeans obviously don't take kindly to the idea that Rubio is more tied up with Venezuelan related matters than with Ukrainian and European ones. I mean, that might be true, but it's absolutely not what the Europeans want to hear or to be told. And I get the sense that the Europeans feel that Rubio didn't come because the purpose of the United States was to downgrade the importance of the meeting in Paris. Now, some of the sense of anger that exists in London is conveyed in the media here. And I'm going to cite here an article by Edward Lucas, in the London Times. I should say that I'm not sure to what extent he is connected to anybody within the British military or political establishment, but he's absolutely a voice for what might be described as mainstream orthodoxy in Britain on the necessity to support Ukraine to the ultimate. In fact, Lucas, throughout his entire journalistic career that I can remember, has been an implacable foe of President Putin's and of the current Russian government and of Russian foreign policy and indeed Russian domestic policy altogether. And, well, having said that, I will say this, he's also, despite the fact that I disagree with him on pretty much everything, he's also certainly a clever man, and he does set things out very simply. And he says, empty words on Ukraine spell doom for NATO. Posturing with a hollowed out military will only encourage Putin, always they say Putin, to further split the West. Well, about that, I don't think Putin is trying to do very much. The West is busy splitting itself. But anyway, he goes on to say this. We are promising forces we do not have to enforce a ceasefire that does not exist under a plan that is yet to be drawn up, endorsed by a superpower that is no longer our ally, to deter an adversary that has far greater willpower than we do. That is the upshot of this week's joint declaration by Britain, France and other countries launching a multinational force that will be supposedly deployed in a post-ceasefire Ukraine. And then Lucas talks about Greenland, the fact that Trump seems to be more focused on that, as he puts it, the world order, he means, of course, the Western rules-based international order, is melting faster than the Arctic ice. He talks about the deplorable state of the British Armed Forces. The British Army has at best 25,000 combat-capable troops to do everything. We are struggling to keep even 1,000 of them deployed as a tripwire in Estonia. We have almost no air defences for them or for the home front. Our munitions and spare parts stockpiles, top secret information here, just Google it, would run out within days of a real war. Our hollowed out armed forces lack enablers, the boring but expensive transport, engineering, maintenance, construction, and other capabilities necessary to keep a deployed force effective. And then he says, even if we do scrape together a ragtag force to spend a few months in Ukraine, what are the rules of engagement? And then he discusses what does actually happen if there is fighting with the Russians. And he then goes on to say that what might have made a small Anglo-French force effective might have been a convincing security guarantee. That was the approach the Western powers took in West Berlin, a militarily undefendable, symbolically vital bastion of Western freedom deep inside communist East Germany. But this worked because American presidents, from Kennedy to Reagan, made it clear that any Soviet attack on the former German capital would trigger war. And he says this is lacking now. though two US envoys, he obviously means Witkoff and Kushner, were present at the Paris launch of the joint declaration, they spoke only of vague security protocols. There is no sign of the United States putting Putin under pressure to agree to the proposed and still vague ceasefire deal. This comment, by the way, about the Americans not putting pressure on the Russians is the only part of this article with which I disagree, let alone taking any risk when it comes to enforcing it. And he says that without the Americans, this is all pointless and hopeless, but that is the reality. And I don't know, as I said, who he has been speaking to or who has been speaking to him or whether anyone has, but he does reflect the mood in London. The meeting in Paris for Starmer and Macron, and by the way, Merz as well, was a disaster. And that applies to Zelensky as well. They came expecting an American commitment, a cast iron American commitment, and instead they came away with nothing. Now, that then brings me back to the topic of the relations between Russia and the United States, because ever since Trump became president of the United States, we've had this endless, complex dance, which suggests at one moment that there are negotiations, next moment that the United States is intent on escalating. We've had claims that the United States has cut off intelligence to Ukraine for a week, contradicted and refuted by more recent information. We've had the Americans claiming that they're disengaging from the war. We've had admissions then that the CIA is actually behind drone attacks, the Ukrainian drone offensive on the Russians. We've had announcements of the United States that they want better relations with Russia. We've had sanctions imposed on Russia in the form of the recent sanctions on Lukoil and Rosneft. We've had this enormously complex dance. We've had American agreements or apparent agreements with the Russians in Anchorage, which the Russians interpreted as an American agreement to Istanbul Plus. The set of proposals Putin made in the speech he gave to the Foreign Ministry on the 14th of June 2024. And then we've had further steps taken to the United States that appear to retreat from Istanbul Plus. And this strange game of pressure, of attempting to both simultaneously needle and provoke and pressure the Russians, even whilst apparently trying to negotiate with them, continues. So we've had drone attacks on on ships, some of them not flying Russian flags, by the way, but we've had drone attacks on ships, trading and taking oil in Russian ports, in the Black Sea, in the Mediterranean, off the coast of Libya, off the coast of West Africa. We've had admissions now in the American media that the United States, the CIA, has materially assisted the Ukrainians in carrying out these attacks. I have been told by a source who has information from the Russian side that it is indeed the Ukrainians who are carrying out these drone attacks, and they're carrying out these drone attacks from a refurbished old Soviet-era Foxtrot submarine that somebody sold to them, and that this submarine is operating with the assistance of a Western power, which, as we now know, is none other than the United States. So anyway, I mean, I just passed that on about the Foxtrot submarine. I haven't seen that appear anywhere in any open source, but the source that has provided me with this information has been consistently reliable up to now, just to say. So anyway, so the United States has been doing all of this. And of course, back in the autumn, they were talking about supplying Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine. The Russians then pushed back very strongly on that, and the US backed off. Then we've had various reports at various times that President Trump was going to go along with the bone-crushing sanctions that Senator Lindsey Graham and Senator Richard Blumenthal cobbled together way back, I believe, in April of last year, and which have at various times appeared to be about to come to the floor of the Senate. President Trump seemed to endorse that proposal briefly in July. He then backtracked on it. He then went back to it in November, and there was a meeting then between him and Senator Lindsey Graham, and Lindsey Graham came out ecstatically happy and announced that President Trump seemed to be giving the green light to this proposal. And then the idea of this bone-crushing sanctions bill seemed to melt away. But now, over the last 24 hours, Senator Graham has come back. He said that he's had an excellent conversation with President Trump, and President Trump has again given the green light to Blumenthal's and Graham's bone-crushing sanctions bill, and it is going to come before the Senate. So Senator Graham hopes early next week. Well, we've been here before, and well, we'll see whether anything actually comes out of it this time. The Russians are not afraid of this so-called bone-crushing sanctions bill. And again, I have to say that the bill, at least Senator Graham's comments, seem to me to show some lack of understanding of what it is exactly that is going on. So amongst the countries that might be targeted for bone-crushing sanctions if they continue to buy Russian oil, according to Senator Graham, under the provisions of this bill, China, India, and of course they have been so identified before, but also Brazil. Now, I don't understand that at all, because as I understand it, Brazil is not just an oil, not only produces all the oil that it consumes, but is actually an oil exporter. Not a huge one, but nonetheless it exports oil. I've never heard that the Russians export oil to Brazil. Maybe they do. Maybe there's some arrangement here that I do not know about or understand. But frankly, if they do, this is a trivial trade. The idea that imposing 500% sanctions on Brazil or strong-arming the Brazilians to stop buying Russian oil is going to have any effect in Moscow is absurd. It proves to me yet again that Senator Graham comes up with all kinds of ideas but never sits down properly and thinks them out and thinks them through, and really doesn't understand much of what he's talking about. I'm sorry to say it so bluntly, but that is my sense of this. Anyway, coming back to this, well, we will see what exactly it is that President Trump does, whether he does go along with the bone-crushing sanctions bill, and whether he does actually impose these massive sanctions on India and China, which are the only two countries that ultimately matter here. I've already discussed what would happen if those sanctions were ever imposed. They would cause some economic problems for the Russians, but the West massively overstates the importance of the Russian economy, of its energy sector. It probably now accounts for something like 10% of Russian GDP, probably less than that at the moment because of the fall in the price of oil. And it's important to stress that around half of that relates to trade in oil that is conducted internally within Russia itself. It is consistently overlooked by people in the West that though Russia is a massive energy exporter, it is also a very large energy consumer. It consumes a very large proportion of the oil and gas that it produces. In fact, some months ago, I had a very interesting article that pointed out to me that email by somebody who knows who is very well informed about these matters, and I basically confirmed it, that the Russian authorities, the Russian energy authorities, have for many years now been pursuing a policy of, as they put it, gasifying Russia. In other words, distributing natural gas across the entire Russian energy complex in order to make heating energy and most energy, to base most energy on a mix of nuclear power and natural gas instead of oil, in place of oil and coal. And this has been largely achieved in Western Russia, but not yet in Central and Eastern Russia. And one of the great benefits for the Russians of the Power of Siberia pipelines that they are connecting to China is not just that this will provide Russia with the opportunity to supply natural gas in ever bigger quantities, volumes, to China, but that it will also enable the Russians to complete the program of gasifying the energy mix of the eastern and central regions of Russia, where gasification has not yet even properly started. So anyway, that's one thing. Again, I doubt that Senator Graham or indeed Senator Blumenthal or many of the people in the Senate know about any of this, or that they're even interested in it. Just to say, even though, as I said, in order to make decisions here, they, properly speaking, ought to be. Secondly, one of the countries that they're targeting, which is of course China, is going to buy Russian oil and gas irrespective of what the United States does. If the United States were to impose 500% tariffs on China, the Chinese would nonetheless still continue to buy oil and gas from Russia, because for the Chinese, it has now become a strategic priority that they should do so. And after the events in Venezuela, it has become still more so a strategic priority. One of the objectives of the American actions with respect to Venezuela is to cut off the supply of Venezuelan oil to China. Now, that cannot amount to a huge amount of China's oil imports, just say. But anyway, that has been the clearly stated objective. And President Trump continues to talk about it and has done so over the last 2 days. Given that this is so, and given that China does need oil, it produces some of its own, but it has to import oil. Inevitably, any and all attempts by the United States to restrict supplies of oil to China are going to compel the Chinese to rely on China's most reliable partner, which is, of course, Russia. And what will happen is what is certain to happen anyway as a result of this attack on Venezuela is that the Chinese are going to crank up their imports of Russian oil to replace whatever oil they used to source from Venezuela, which they no longer can. I ought to add, by the way, that of course the Chinese will work hard to develop their own domestically produced energy, and that will no doubt play an increasingly important role. But I've also been reading that one other response that the Chinese are now thinking of pursuing is to increase the pipelines, the number of pipelines that link China with Russia, so that oil and gas are delivered to China securely by land and not by sea, where in a way that makes them essentially impervious to American interference. So anyway, let's nonetheless assume that the United States imposes 500% tariffs on China because China insists on importing Russian oil. What will China do? It will, of course, take retaliatory action, as it did last year. And immediately, the obvious action it will take is it will stop exports of rare earths. And the President, Donald Trump, remains fixated with the issue of rare earths. He's looking everywhere for rare earths, wherever they can be found. But as been pointed out by many people, the key here is not finding the rare earths, which are not especially rare, but refining them. And here, the United States is still not past first base. So at some point, in the face of that Chinese retaliation, which is what we saw last year, the United States will be obliged to pull back. And I'm going to suggest that this time the Chinese rather, are not going to provide the Americans, even with the very limited off-ramp that Xi Jinping gave Trump at the end of last year when the two of them met in South Korea and the Americans basically pulled back on many of the sanctions and tariffs they had imposed against China. Just to say. So, Trump presumably knows this. I suspect that in the end, he's going to balk at another economic blockade of China, given that the Chinese are certain to take countermeasures. And of course, if we end up in a situation where the United States is imposing bone-crushing sanctions on India, but not on China, India being supposedly America's friend, this is going to damage still further the relationship between India and the United States, which is already fracturing. So anyway, my point is that it is untrue that the United States has not been trying to put pressure on the Russians. It has been trying to do so continuously. It began to do so in 2014 in a concerted way when it first imposed sectoral sanctions against the Russian economy in combination with its European allies. And it has gone further and further up on the sanctions escalator ever since. It's conducted attacks against Russia. It's possibly assisted in an assassination attempt against Putin in December, just saying. It's carried out more attacks. It's helped the Ukrainians conduct attacks against Russian refineries. It's provided Ukraine with huge amounts of weapons and vast amounts of money. And it has failed to shift Russian policy at all. This is what the Foreign Ministry statement about the meeting on January 6th show. When you read that statement, it becomes transparently clear that the Russians have not retreated from Istanbul Plus, from the conditions that Putin set out to the Foreign Ministry on the 14th of June 2024 by so much as a millimeter. And the Russians are in a much stronger position now than they were on the 14th of June 2024. Putin said all of those things on the 14th of June 2024, not because the Russians wanted to set out in detail what their conditions would be, but because they were under pressure from their friends in BRICS, India, Brazil, and to some extent China, to spell out what their goals in the special military operation were. And Putin set out the goals, and he got the Indians, the Chinese, and the Brazilians off his back in the run-up to the BRICS meeting, the vital BRICS meeting in Kazan, in Russia, in the autumn of 2024, in October 2024. Since then, the relations between the United States and those three countries, China, India, and Brazil, have markedly deteriorated. And since then, all three of these countries, China, India, and Brazil, have shown growing understanding of the Russian position. They do not exert as much pressure on the Russians as they once did, because they have become increasingly angry and frustrated with the United States itself and with its actions, and they have become increasingly sympathetic to the Russian position. The Russian economy itself has, as I've discussed in many programs, successfully adapted to the sanctions, and the Russians have recently published further reports pointing out that they brought down inflation successfully last year, and managed to do so, avoiding a recession, and that they expect a return to growth, strong growth in the Russian economy in the second half of this year as interest rates begin to fall and fall significantly further than they have up to now done. So all of this pressure has achieved nothing. And that is the American dilemma. That is why we get all of these various contradictory moves. The United States does not want to get drawn into a conflict with Russia in Europe. It does not want to give Ukraine security guarantees that might create any possible risk of the United States getting drawn into a war itself with Russia. It's absolutely happy to do anything it can and everything it can to weaken Russia and to fight Russia, but it will not fight Russia directly. It has to act through proxies. Ukraine, in this case, it doesn't want to be put in a position where it has to fight Russia itself directly alongside its proxies. Obviously, it is afraid of a nuclear war, but I suspect that deep down there are worries that on Ukrainian territory, a conventional war with Russia, if it was just that, would end also in a military defeat for the United States, because the Americans would be fighting the Russians where the Russians are strongest and where the United States is weakest, in a place where, to misquote an interview that Obama gave to The Atlantic, the Russians will always possess escalatory dominance. So they are afraid to give the security guarantees. They want, however, to give security guarantees in order to show to their European allies and to the Ukrainians that they're not weak and that they're not afraid of the Russians. They've been trying, therefore, to square this circle by getting the Russians to agree that the United States, to permit the United States to give Ukraine security guarantees. But the Russians have adamantly refused and continue to refuse. So the United States has been left trying and failing to find further means to put pressure on the Russians, to get the Russians to agree to something the Russians will never agree to. And that really is the story of the negotiations in 2025 and the negotiations in 2026. It's not that the United States doesn't want to give security guarantees to Ukraine. It's that he doesn't want to honor those security guarantees, to be put into a position where its bluff is called. And at the same time, the Russians will never consent to that, because they obviously realize that if they did give security guarantees of this kind, they did agree to security guarantees of this kind being given to Ukraine, that would not resolve the underlying problems in the conflict, which the Russians want resolved once and for all. On the contrary, it would be a pathway to a greater long-term crisis. The Americans have no real leverage over the Russians, though they don't want to admit to this. The Russians, by the way, by contrast, actually do have significant leverage, and that is the leverage that the war is providing them, because with every day their advance on the battlefronts continues. Now, over the last 24 hours, we have had another massive, devastating Russian attack on the Ukrainian energy complex. Huge tracts of Ukrainian territory, especially Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporozhye regions, now suffer from blackouts. And there are reports that in the city of Dnipro itself, people are being advised to store water, because the attacks, the energy blackouts, and the electricity shortages in conditions of deepening winter are affecting the supply of water as well. This is a terrible situation, and it gets worse for Ukraine every day. Even as Zelensky himself enjoys the comforts of Paris, many of his people in Ukraine, the people he is supposed to be president of and supposed to be concerned for, are cold and freezing, and some of them, it seems, are running out of water. So we've had that massive attack by the Russians on the energy system. And there's been further information from the front lines. The Russians continue their seemingly unstoppable advance in Zaporozhye region, both from the east, from Gulyapolye and from the west, from Stepnogorsk. And I understand that the Russians are now 20 kilometers from Orechov, advancing towards it from the eastward direction. And I believe they're closer to Orechov as they advance towards it from the west. Of course, in the south, in places like Malaya Tokmachka and Novodanilovka, the Russians are much closer. And the Russian Chief of General Staff, General Gerasimov, said that there is already street fighting going on in Orechov, though there is no corroboration of this. Further north, there are increasing numbers of reports from both Russian and Ukrainian reporters that suggest that the village of Novopavlivka in Dnipropetrovsk region is now finally about to fall. The Russians seem to have captured most of the supply routes to Novopavlivka. It appears that the village, though not fully surrounded, is mostly so. And the Russians appear to control probably more than half of it. Redovka, the Russian newspaper in Smolensk, claimed that it was about to fall about 6 weeks ago, but clearly that was wrong. But this time it does seem as if Novopavlivka is indeed close to falling. Further east, there has been less news over the last 24 hours about what is going on north of Pokrovsk and Mirnograd, but it does seem as if the Russian advance on Konstantinovka is tightening, that the Russians have now taken positions to the west of Konstantinovka and may have broken into Konstantinovka from the west as well. And I get the sense that we are probably still quite a long way from the fall of Konstantinovka. Nonetheless, that fall will take place at some point within the next few weeks, possibly even this month. And in Siversk, the Russian advance seems unstoppable. And in Liman, the Russians seem to be very close to cutting off all the supply routes into Liman. And there is now apparently footage that confirms that the Russians are indeed positioned in the north of Liman and in the south, as Gerasimov told Putin about a week ago. Now, in Kupiansk, fighting appears to continue both in the town and outside the town, and we continue to get all sorts of contradictory reports. The Russians continue to insist that the town is still firmly under their control, that the Ukrainians do break in from time to time, but only in small groups and are quickly dealt with. The Ukrainians still speak of an ongoing counter-offensive in this area. However, we are now starting to get what look to me to be more credible video footage. There are photographs that show Russian soldiers raising their flags in the village of Palodi to the east of Kupiansk, on the east bank of the Oskol River, which does indeed appear to confirm that the cauldron where the Ukrainian troops have been surrounded on the east bank of the Oskol River is indeed collapsing. The major Russian objective in this area, territorial objective, I should say, appears to be the village of Kupiansk Uzlovoy, which is located to the south of Kupiansk, and which the Russians probably do need to capture in order to wrap up the business in Kupiansk entirely. But there's also now footage which is appearing showing movements of Russian troops well to the west of Kupiansk it's difficult to get exactly a sense of what they're doing there. Some are suggesting that they are trying to encircle the Ukrainians who are still trying to break into Kupiansk. Maybe. Or maybe this is a case of the Russians taking positions in advance of a westward offensive that is coming. What I would say is that there's been reports from Ukraine that the Ukrainians have built another fortified line well to the west of Kupiansk to prevent further Russian advances westwards. And this suggests to me that the Ukrainians do understand that Kupiansk itself is lost and that the cauldron to the east of Kupiansk is also about to collapse, and that they are preparing for the battles which will come, which will be well to the west of Kupiansk itself. For the record, I don't believe that the Russian plan so much is to advance westwards. I think that the Russian plan, the immediate Russian plan, will be to advance southwards towards places like Izium and Balakleya. And I think that Russian activity further south on the east bank of the Oskol River in close to a small town called Barova is probably also intended to prepare the ground for a counterattack to recapture these two places, Izium and Balakleya, which the Russians briefly held until the autumn of 2022, and which the Ukrainians then recaptured, but which the Russians would need in order to encircle Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. There was an interesting report which I read, by the way, on Slavyangrad, which, again, I would suggest people should still look up. It is a pro-Russian website, just to say, or Telegram channel, but it does provide interesting and reliable news overall, and accurate information overall. Anyway, it suggested that once all of these places, Konstantinovka and the others, are cleared by the Russians and the fighting begins to become confined to Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, quite apart from all their various other problems, the Ukrainians are going to find that their forces are becoming compressed into smaller spaces, and that this could open the way for very, very devastating losses for the Ukrainians on the same scale as what they suffered during the Battle of Bakhmut in the spring of 2023. Anyway, that is the military situation, and it is what the Russians are mostly focused on, and it is what gives them the long-term confidence. They know that on the vital area of this war, the battlefields in Ukraine, they are winning. And all of the other things that the Americans are trying to do to put pressure on them are things that they can absorb. And that means that long-term, they really don't feel any need to make any substantive concessions. And the Foreign Ministry statement that was made today, which I published, basically confirms that. Now, I'm going to finish today's program by returning to the topic of Venezuela. And here it is becoming, in my opinion, increasingly bleak. President Trump and his officials are now essentially saying that the post-Maduro objective is for Venezuela basically to hand over all of its oil to the United States. The United States will sell the oil, and this is going to be an indefinite arrangement, will sell the oil. President Trump himself will decide what happens to this money, to the profits from these oil sales. Some of it, he will decide, should be given to Venezuela, and the Venezuelans will then use whatever sums of money he generously decides to give them in order to buy products exclusively from the United States. Venezuela will cease all further economic or commercial relations with American adversaries such as China, Russia, and Cuba. This is exploitation of a country in its grossest form. The Venezuelans, for their part, are saying that yes, they are prepared to provide the Americans with oil, but Venezuelan officials, and by the way, Venezuelan union leaders, are insisting that all that they've agreed to is not to give their oil to the United States, but to sell their oil to the United States at market prices. Now, of course, that's what the Venezuelans may say, but the Americans are trying to put the squeeze on Venezuela by relentlessly tightening their blockade. The episode with the Bella 1 Marinara tanker and all the various other tankers that the Americans have been seizing, and they seized another tanker as well in the Caribbean, which the Russians make no comment about, which suggests that it is not Russian now. Anyway, all of these American attacks on tankers, seizures of tankers, are basically intended to put the squeeze on Venezuela, to prevent Venezuela exporting oil except via the United States. And, well, this is coercion at its most ruthless. Now, I've been reading articles. There was a long article in the Financial Times which discussed the condition of Venezuela's oil industry and also confirmed that it is in deep crisis and cannot produce the quantities of oil that perhaps President Trump and his officials imagine. US oil companies are apparently telling the administration that they are not prepared to go back into Venezuela and develop the oil industry there without long-term guarantees, which include American guarantees for protection, security protection, given the very unstable situation within Venezuela itself. The Financial Times has another long article discussing what a fractured society Venezuela is and alleging that large parts of Venezuela are effectively out of government control and that there are many armed groups and armed forces in Venezuela that would be very hostile to the United States, some of them very close to the oil fields, based very close to the oil fields, where they could create massive problems. So the administration is in the process of applying an immense squeeze on Venezuela. It's refusing, in effect, as far as I can see, to deal with Venezuela on anything other than, you might say, neo-colonialist terms. Ignoring the realities. I doubt that Venezuela can satisfy the American demands, but if it doesn't, it's very soon going to be forced to print money. And it will undoubtedly, at that point, collapse into hyperinflation. And that could very well result in complete destabilization and collapse. Were that to happen, the country would probably fracture with armed groups in control of large areas of the country. And there would be migrant flows northwards, heading ultimately to the United States of a size that we have never seen. I can very easily see how this is going to go wrong, and the plan itself is terrible, but at an ethical level, but I can easily see how it's going to go horribly wrong. Well, this is where I'm going to finish today's program. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. Please remember, if you've liked this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.